He didn't send anyone to help. Let us spurt. Have you ever stepped into an empty room within your own home, drawn the door shut, and been suddenly seized by the sensation that you had just interrupted something? Not the mundane unease of arriving in a strange place, but rather a fleeting realization, nebulous yet piercingly cold, that the very atmosphere within the room had hastily rearranged itself into a semblance of order the exact moment your hand turned the doorknob. If you have ever stopped dead in your tracks, unconsciously muttering a foolish apology to the vacant air, comment "yes" right now. If you believe that to be merely the paranoia of an over-evolved brain, forever seeking human faces within senseless clouds, comment "no, I genuinely need to know this ratio." Because the man in tonight's dossier was once someone who invariably chose no. He was a worshiper of physical truths, right up until the moment he crossed the threshold of a 3-story stone edifice, rising amidst the deathly isolation of the Appalachians, and realized that the house, through some inhuman mechanism, already knew the exact minute, the precise second, he would depart. Aurelius Vane was a man sculpted by right angles, plumb lines, and numbers that did not possess the capacity to lie. At the age of 38 in that ashen autumn of 1902, he bore an outward appearance not quite of premature age, but rather of the unyielding rigidity of a man who had learned to excise all superfluous emotions from the cycle of living. His hands were massive, heavily calloused, callouses accumulated not from wielding a hoe or swinging an axe, but from tracing along miles of cobblestone foundations, from rapping upon countless rotting purlins to listen for the reverberations of time. To Vane, this world harbored no space for magic, for specters, or for curses. A collapsing house did not fall because it bore a heavy karmic debt, but because its mason had miscalculated the subsidence of the clay beneath its footings after 40 winter cycles of freezing and thawing. He didn't send anyone to attic. At midnight was not the footfall of a restless spirit, but the thermal expansion of pine wood as the room's temperature plummeted below the threshold of 7 degrees Celsius. Vane made his living by appraising reality. His firm, Colcroftoft and Associates in Cincinnati, existed and thrived precisely due to his ability to perceive all things through the lens of inevitable decay. Everything was breaking down. Everything was dying at a measurable velocity. That was the most magnificent and comforting law he had ever known. Yet, that very law began to fracture on the 4th day of his journey as he penetrated the deepest core of Harlan County. The route leading into the Crest Hollow Valley in October of 1902 was not so much a road as it was a fading memory of civilization, being methodically erased by nature. He didn't send anyone prior. Coal syndicates had carved through this mountain, bringing with them the roar of machinery and the avarice of men. Capital invariably flows toward cheaper frontiers where less blood need be spilled. They departed, abandoning this land to a terrifying, oppressive silence. The silence in Appalachia was not a mere absence of sound. It was a heavy entity, possessing mass, possessing texture. It pressed against the eardrums, slithered through Vane's thick woolen coat, and seeped directly into his spinal marrow. He didn't send anyone to help. The ancient mountain ranges encompassing him did not bear the majestic beauty depicted in the travel brochures peddled at East Coast railway stations. They were colossal monoliths of stone, harboring a bizarre, almost personal sentience. Riding past the lower slope of a peak the locals unofficially christened the Widow's Shoulder, Vane was struck by a macabre sensation that this terrain remembered something, and that it had actively chosen to keep its mouth clamped shut. The air was frigid and damp, carrying the scent of rotting leaves, of fungal roots, and of a primeval soil that had not been touched by sunlight in a century. His dark brown mare, Prospect, took measured but utterly rigid steps. Vane had been a horseman long enough to intimately understand the fragile boundary, separating fear from caution. A weak-nerved horse would panic at the non-existent. A swaying shadow of a tree, the snap of a brittle twig, They would buck, whinny wildly, and attempt to throw their rider. A careful mare like Prospect was different. Upon detecting genuine peril, she did not flee. She decelerated. She withdrew into herself. She walked, as though she were desperately trying not to awaken the very earth beneath her hooves. As they began to navigate through the dense grove of hemlocks, pushing toward the eastern end of the valley, dictated by that peculiar letter of commission, Prospect's caution devolved into a state of excruciating endurance. The muscular ridges along the animal's back corded tightly beneath the leather saddle. Her breath plumed into cloudy white exhalations, short and frantic, not from exhaustion, but because she was violently attempting to suppress any sound from escaping. Vane tightened his grip on the reins slightly, his brow furrowing. There was no scent of bear or cougar around them. There was an absolute absence of the musk of predators. The atmosphere here was absolutely bereft of the life of other creatures. Not a single bird's trill, not a cricket's chirp, not even the faint rustling of rodents beneath the carpet of fallen leaves. The hemlocks had grown impossibly dense, interlacing their needle-laden canopies high above into a gargantuan vault, filtering the pallid autumn dawn into a dismal, diffuse, and frigid illumination, as though viewed through a pane of frosted glass. The only living creature feeling unsettled was the horse. Yet Vane's rationality compelled him to continue driving the heel of his boot into her flank. To him, the creeping unease of an animal could not be catalogued within an appraisal report. Everything had to be witnessed. Everything had to be quantified. Then the hemlock stand began to thin. The undulating terrain leveled out. And at the terminus of the path, materializing from the murky early morning fog, stood Caulfield House. Vane hauled back on the reins, forcing Prospect to a dead halt at the tree line. His own breath seemed to freeze solid within his ribs. For the first time in his 20-year career, his eyes, customarily adept at piercing through physical structures, were utterly defeated by an extreme absurdity. He remained petrified there, time drifting by for perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps half an hour, merely struggling to digest and rationalize what he was beholding. But the longer he stared, the more his logical brain emitted razor-sharp warning signals. The house was simply too large. That was the first realization to slap him across the face of his intuition. It was large in a manner that defied all reason. It could not possibly exist at this abyssal depth within the mountainous wilderness. It vaulted upward into 3 imposing single stories, with a partial 4th attic floor manifesting as a pair of asymmetrical gables thrusting starkly against the slate-gray sky. Transporting such a mammoth volume of materials, boulders of deep gray, bordering on pitch-black, massive timber logs untouched by industrial sawmills. Through the muddy trails of Harlan County in the mid-19th century was an unsolvable equation of both logistics and finance. Unless its master possessed the sovereign power to conscript an unpaid army of laborers, or unless this dwelling had stood here long before the hemlock forest had sprouted to consume it. But what caused Vane's stomach to clench in a sickening, icy spasm was not the sheer magnitude of the architecture. It was the immaculate integrity of its structure. The house was abandoned. No smoke curled from its chimneys, no ruts from carriage wheels or wagons marred the moss-eaten path. According to the letter of commission, the owner, Harmon Caulfield, was long dead, and yet it bore absolutely no stigmata of decay. Vane began to count. 1, 6, 15, 23. 23 glass window panes manifested across the front facade and the eastern elevation. In the Appalachian Mountains, where winter temperatures could fluctuate by 30 degrees between day and night, the relentless expansion and contraction of wooden frames would inevitably shatter fragile glass panes after mere decades without maintenance. Frost would slither into the most microscopic fissures, freeze, expand, and pulverize everything. Gale-force winds would hurl snapped branches against the surfaces. Deserted homes in this region universally shared one trait. They were rendered blind their window sockets either smashed to shards or boarded up with rotting planks to veil the emptiness. Elfield House, however, did not. 23 windows remained perfectly intact. The glass harbored not a single hairline fracture, bore no cobwebs, and was utterly unclouded by the accumulation of grime. It gleamed, reflecting the frigid gray sky, shielding a pitch-black abyss behind the panes. From afar, they looked exactly like 23 closed eyes, or 23 unseen eyes, coldly observing the interloper who had just trespassed into their field of vision. Gain swallowed hard. He cast his gaze down to the earth. The flagstone path leading from the tree line to the front door was encroached upon by weeds and green moss, yet the stones themselves remained impeccably flush, the mortar joints entirely unheaved by invasive roots. Nature, it seemed, was permitted to crawl right up to the architectural perimeter, but was absolutely forbidden from breaching its integrity. It was a static, unnatural, and intensely authoritative preservation. Finally, Vane's eyes settled upon the focal point of that entire shadowy monolith. The front door. It was shut fast, and it was red. Not a faded, flaking, or rust-colored red, suffering from exposure to the acid rains and blistering suns of 100,000 passing days. It was a violently saturated, deep, viscous, and mercilessly fresh red. It was the kind of hue that demanded a craftsman to meticulously and deliberately apply countless heavy coats. One only paints a door such a color when they intend for it to be seen from a great distance like a beacon or a waypoint marking a map that does not exist. Amidst the drab, ashen context of the withering forest and the blackened stone walls, the red door flared like an open, gaping wound, raw, fresh, and throbbing. The primal survival instinct within Vane's brain shrieked at him to turn back, to abandon this commission, to flee Harlan County. He didn't send anyone to help. That a house could not autonomously sustain its own perfection in the face of the second law of thermodynamics regarding entropy, unless some force were intervening at a molecular level every single day. He didn't send anyone to help, but Aurelius Vane was a man of mensuration. If he turns back and fled before an empty house, he would be committing treason against the very architecture that constructed his identity. The fear welling inside him at this moment was not a panicked scream, but rather a frigid suffocation, slowly constricting his throat. It akin to the sensation of reading the final line of a contract, only to realize that all the clauses you firmly believed were drafted for your protection were, in truth, snares already laid in wait. Heavily, he swung himself down from the saddle. Prospect did not stir. She stood as rigidly as a malformed wooden statue, her back still locked in tension. He didn't send anyone to help. Vane carefully tethered the reins to the trunk of a hemlock at the forest's edge, intentionally avoiding too tight a knot, preserving for the beast a marginal chance to snap her tether should the need arise. He didn't send anyone to help. He smoothed the creases of his heavy coat with his hands, adjusted his collar, and brushed his fingers against the leather-bound journal resting obediently in his breast pocket. It was his solitary anchor tethering him to reality. Vane inhaled a profound breath of the valley's deathly air, then set his foot upon the first flagstone of the path. Each of his footsteps echoed with a hollow thud. Vane advanced until he stood before the crimson door. Proximity did not diminish the absurdity of that hue. On the contrary, it exhibited a chillingly flawless, unblemished smoothness across the wooden surface, devoid of a single scratch. Adhering to a professional habit forged over decades, and perhaps on a deeper level, to afford his mind a few fleeting seconds to retreat, Vane raised his leather-gloved hand and knocked 3 times upon the wood. Thud, thud, thud. The sound struck the dense grain, echoing briefly before being instantaneously devoured by the encircling stone walls and the hushed forest. There was no reverberation. There was no shuffling of human footsteps from within. He did not anticipate anyone answering the door. The letter had explicitly dictated this was a property requiring appraisal prior to the settling of an estate. He placed his hand upon the tarnished brass doorknob. His hand trembled slightly, a final rebellion of the flesh. Vane ground his teeth together, repressed the sensation, and twisted the knob. Contrary to all expectations of a rusted lock, or the agonizing shriek of unlubricated hinges, the knob turned with consummate, liquid smoothness. The ponderous door swung open soundlessly into the gloom. And the first thing to assault the senses of Aurelius Vane was not a visual image, but a gust of air exhaling from the belly of the house. That draught bore a fragrance that did not belong to the kingdom of the dead. It was the scent of virgin cedar, sharp, frigid, and overwhelmingly potent, identical to the lingering aroma upon that peculiar commission letter he had received 10 days prior from a faceless sender. The house was not rotting. The house had been holding its breath in anticipation, and it had just exhaled to welcome him. Vane stepped over the threshold, walking directly into that exhalation laced with cedar, and allowed the shadows of the foyer to swallow him whole. Reaching blindly behind him, he pushed the red door shut. The brass latchbolt slid into its strike plate with a sharp, arid clack, and then, the very instant that mechanical sound ceased, the entire acoustic world Vane had ever known was abruptly severed. It did not gradually taper into nothingness. It was amputated, like the brutal slash of a cleaver through sound waves. The silence that crashed down upon him was not the conventional absence of noise found in a vacant dwelling. Abandoned homes perpetually maintain their own acoustic ecosystems. The faint whistling of wind slicing through crevices in window frames, the groaning of floorboards as temperatures shift, the wretched gnawing of rat colonies behind the plaster, or even the subtle sighs of the timber skeleton itself, buckling under its ceaseless war against gravity. But Caulfield House produced no vibrations whatsoever. It was absolutely mute, a silence imbued with mass and atmospheric pressure. Vane felt his eardrums compress, tingling as if he had just plunged into the abyssal depths of a gargantuan cistern. The violent thumping of his own heart hammered back against his eardrums, a singular, solitary rhythm, pathetic in its deafening loudness. He stood motionless in the foyer, permitting his vision to slowly acclimate to the wan, ashen light filtering hazily through the heavily draped windows. And in that moment the scent slithered up his nostrils once more, threading through his mucous membranes to slide down into the very base of his lungs. The scent of cedar. As an appraiser who had ransacked hundreds of basements and attics, Vane possessed an intimate understanding of the chemical properties of odors. Cedar was the timber of preservation. Its essential oils repelled insects, thwarted mildew, and shielded belongings from decay. Men utilized it to line trousseaux or panel the interiors of modest closets. Yet, essential oil is a volatile compound. Within a sealed enclosure, over the march of time, olfactory molecules diffuse, reach saturation, and inevitably wane. After 50 years, the epoch this residence was purported to have existed, the stench of cedar ought to have been reduced to a phantom memory, a wispy residue drowned out by the acrid musk of dust and mold. However, the atmosphere he was currently inhaling was razor-sharp, pungent, and radiantly fresh. It was so viscous that Vane suffered the delusion he could taste the acrid bite of the tree's resin upon the tip of his tongue. Not a singular mote of dust danced within the murky beams of light. There was zero scent of decomposition. The piercing clarity of this fragrance was an offense against physics. He didn't send anyone to help. It behaved like a mortuary embalming fluid, perpetually pumped through the circulatory system of the edifice, anchoring this architectural monolith in an eternal state of being newly finished. It was not shielding the house from the ravages of time. Rather, it had entirely frozen the dimensional fabric of time within these stony confines. Vane extracted the leather-bound journal from his breast pocket, stripped off his right glove, and drew out a stubby pencil. His flesh was ice-cold. He desperately clung to the rationality of numerics, his sole armament against the encroaching irrationality. He began to walk. Every strike of his heel against the rigid oak floorboards should have generated a resounding boom within the cavernous expanse of the ground floor. but the house Ravenny swallowed all audio. The report of his leather boots hammering the wood was negated precisely at the point of impact. Arid and violently truncated. He stepped into the parlor. The sprawling room was submerged in the morbid gloom of the October morn. His eyes swept across the wainscoting, over the frigid marble fireplace, before coming to rest upon the furnishings. A baseless chill slithered down his spine, mimicking the sensation of infinitesimal insectoid legs creeping beneath his shirt. The house was not vacuous. It was fully appointed. Edidance was not the disarray of a family forced to flee into the dead of night, leaving behind furnishings too burdensome to bear. Nor was it the detritus of a bankruptcy, where valuables were seized, abandoning only tattered rags and skeletal bed frames. Caulfield House was immaculately curated, pristine, and comprehensively furnished to a point of sheer cruelty. He didn't send anyone to help. It looked precisely as though the master of the estate had merely donned his coat and stepped out for a stroll minutes prior, due to return at any given second for his midday luncheon. Upon the mantelpiece, a cast bronze pendulum clock stood in dead silence. Its exquisitely filigreed hands were paralyzed at 11 minutes past 3. The metal bore 0 oxidation. The glass was unblemished by a single layer of dust. It had not died of senescence. It had stopped simply because someone had ceased to wind it. Yet, what caused Vane's respiration to grow shallow and accelerated was the arrangement of 2 deep emerald velvet wingback chairs positioned in the center of the room. They were not squared away, symmetrically flanking the hearth, like display pieces in a fine furnishings emporium. They were set facing one another, albeit with a slight, almost imperceptible skew. One was angled delicately toward the casement. The other was rotated a fraction of a degree toward the doorway. The depressions within the velvet cushions still bore a ghostly imprint. It was the precise geometry, the exact posture that 2 chairs would assume after a pair of human beings had been seated there, conversing only to rise and depart. That asymmetry breathed the exhalation of life. Vane staggered a half-step backward, feeling his stomach churn with a sickening wave of nausea. The panoramic reality of the ground floor materializing in his mind was not that of a living space, but rather a grotesque diorama. This residence was a colossal theatrical stage. Everything, from the wingback chairs to the dining table in the adjacent hall, laid impeccably with 8 gleaming silver settings and razor-creased napkins, down to the leather-spined volumes aligned meticulously on the study shelves, was nothing more than a prop. They were cryogenically suspended in a moment of perfection by someone, or something, that maintained their immaculate sanctity day after day, merely lying in wait for a new actor, a new spectator to step across the threshold and occupy this lethal void. He didn't send anyone to help, and, today, the asphyxiating pressure of the ground floor crushed Vane to such an extent that he violently pivoted, marching straight toward the wooden staircase ascending to the 2nd floor. He needed to measure. He needed to unearth fractures, to locate the stigmata of mold, anything to validate that this architecture was still subservient to the laws of physics. He clamped his hand onto the banister, registering the frigid, polished slickness of the ironwood, and began his ascent. The 2nd floor possessed an atmosphere thinner and significantly more tenebrous than the first. Protracted corridors stretched out, lined with barricaded wooden doors. Vane pushed open the final door on the eastern exposure, accessing what appeared to be the master bedchamber. The light here was paler, bleeding through the draperies to illuminate a sprawling bed, dressed in impeccably smooth linens. Upon the nightstand sat a glass oil lamp and a book left splayed open. Vane dared not cast his eyes upon the book's title. He harbored a paralyzing dread that should he read the script upon those pages, he would be formally dragged into the pantomime of this cursed estate. He didn't send anyone to help. He manhandled his brain into focusing on the vocation at hand. Extracting his measuring tape, he commenced quantifying the length and breadth of the room. His boot heels traversed methodically along the western baseboard, his eyes surgically glued to the floorboards, hunting for the slightest symptom of moisture intrusion. Thud, 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 the rhythmic cadence of his boots. And then a discordant acoustic echoed back. Thunk. Vane froze. The toe of his leather boot had just trod upon a floorboard approximately 20 centimeters from the western wall. The tactile feedback transmitted from the sole of his boot to the arch of his foot was intensely familiar, yet grossly perverse in this context. It was not the spongy collapse of timber hollowed by termites or decayed by water rot. Its resistance was fiercely elastic. It was the compression of a mechanical apparatus. A plank deliberately engineered to bear a differential load. He descended languidly, taking a knee upon the floor. With a bare fingertip, he traced the striated grain of the hardwood. The chamber was so profoundly silent that he could hear the abrasive friction of his own keratin scraping across the varnished finish. Before long, his digits snagged upon an agonizingly subtle fissure. The board had not splintered naturally along its grain. It had been surgically severed at both ends with a blade of microscopic thinness, after which the incisions were packed with a composite of beeswax and sawdust, perfectly camouflaged to match the surrounding floor. Without the indiscriminate weight of a misplaced footfall, it would have remained eternally invisible to the mortal eye. A clandestine hollow. Vane's pulse accelerated. Driven partly by the inherent inquisitiveness of a hunter accustomed to prowling the shadowed corners of antiquated estates, and partly by the sheer horror of this flawless premeditation. Employing his thumbnail, he dug viciously into the malleable wax filling the crevice and pried upward with force. A section of timber roughly 60 centimeters in length popped loose, flipping smoothly aside on a deeply concealed hinge. Beneath it lay a shallow umbral cavity, scarcely 10 centimeters deep, gouged directly into the subflooring. There were no jewels, there were no armaments, there were no rolls of yellowed banknotes. Resting forlornly at the bottom of that abyssal wooden niche was nothing but a solitary slip of paper sharply folded into quarters. Vane plunged his hand into the freezing void. The second his fingertips grazed its texture, he recognized the terrifyingly familiar substance. It was a heavy stock vellum, pale cream in complexion, opulent and stiff. As he elevated the parchment to his face, its potent bouquet assaulted his nostrils, striking down his olfactory senses yet again, the violently fresh stench of cedar. The exact same paper, emitting the exact same fragrance as the letter of commission that had lured him into this god-forsaken mountain hollow. His hand betrayed a subtle tremor as he broke the folds. There were no frantic smears of desiccated blood. There was no manic, scrawled penmanship of a soul trembling in the throes of ultimate terror. Anchored dead center upon the immaculate page, there existed only a solitary sentence inscribed in an ink of absolute, unfaded obsidian. The calligraphy upon the paper bore no resemblance to anything penned by a human entity, possessed of emotions, a heartbeat, or the natural imperfections of muscle tremors. Every consonant, every curvature, every gap between the lexicons was mechanically flawless and eerily uniform, as if they had been cast from an iron mold and branded straight into the fiber with an identical, ruthlessly frigid pressure. He didn't send anyone to help. You are not the first to seek out what this house is keeping, and you ought to understand before proceeding any further that the others did not leave easily. Vane knelt immobilized upon the freezing floorboards. The pallid, ashen light from the window failed to penetrate the shadowed corner where he was rooted, yet every singular black letter felt as though it were being viciously gouged into his retinas. Had he unearthed a diary brimming with lunatic shrieks, a torn scrap of blood-soaked linen, or a desperate plea for salvation scratched into the paneling with torn fingernails, his dread might have assumed the shape of conventional macabre folklore. The belief that some deranged psychopath or monstrous entity was lurking within these walls. But no, this string of words was infinitely more horrific than any beast possessing fangs or talons. It was a bureaucratic document. It was frigid, terrifyingly objective, and carried the precise tenor of a managerial system, politely issuing a procedural notification. The architect of this sentence was not attempting to terrify him. It harbored no intent to devour his flesh or rend him limb from limb. It was simply compiling a dossier on him. In that horrifying epiphany, Vane grasped the true nature of the isolation in which he was entrapped. This parchment had not been deposited decades ago for some nameless drifter. The paper's complexion was fresh. Its aroma was piercingly pungent. It had been planted here with extreme recency. Someone or something had possessed an exact blueprint of the surveying habits of an appraiser named Aurelius Vane. He didn't send anyone to help. It knew he would walk flush against the western perimeter of the master bedchamber. It knew he would unearth the yielding floorboard. It had engineered a sequential logic of behavior, much like baiting the precise intersection of a rat's labyrinth, and he had executed his steps with flawless adherence to its design. His free will, his vaunted rationality, and the metrics of which he was so intensely proud, were now reduced to nothing more than pre-populated variables etched within an administrative ledger. This architecture was not a forsaken ruin awaiting its inevitable decay. It was an invisible panopticon, and it had already commenced the process of calculating the very man who was attempting to appraise it. An asphyxiating dread violently seized Vane's chest, not from a deprivation of oxygen, but from the crushing weight of an absurd reality that was actively strangling every physical law he had ever worshipped. The journal clutched in his grip abruptly metamorphosed into a meaningless artifact, yet his legs, driven by the dismal obstinacy of a man fundamentally incapable of accepting a total loss of dominion, refused to turn back. He didn't send anyone to help. Rather than bolting out of the corridor, Vane ran his freezing fingers along the crease of the cream-colored parchment, entombed it deep between the pages of his leather diary, and pivoted to descend toward the kitchen. The house had declared its wager, and the intellect of a man who specialized in the calibration of all worldly things demanded that he delve into the very bowels of this structure to unmask the machinery orchestrating it. Within archaic manors erected in the mid-19th century, the cellar was never merely a foundational anchor. It was the chronicled history documenting the most naked truths regarding unstable soils, corroding ironwork, and the festering rot that the masters eternally sought to camouflage in the upper salons. Vane discovered the descent into the subterranean depths concealed behind a dry goods shelving unit in the larder. The rack was not designed to slide aside. Rather, its very back panel operated as a masquerading portal. He was forced to employ the kerosene lamp that had been staged, with a mocking, flawless perfection, upon the lip of the wash basin. The reservoir of oil within the glass bulb was more than half full, sloshing with a dark, jaundiced amber, evidencing that it had been freshly replenished. He struck a match and ignited the wick. The amber flame trembled as it licked against the chimney glass, projecting his elongated, contorted silhouette across the flagstone floor. Vane inhaled a profound lungful of air and descended the monolithic stone steps that had been gouged directly into the mountain's bedrock. The exact second his boot heel struck the fifth riser, the microclimatic mutation struck him with a violence as visceral as if he had just ruptured an invisible membrane. The asphyxiating perfume of cedar, that embalmer's essence holding absolute dominion over the upper strata of the dwelling, was abruptly severed. There was zero trace of cedar in this abyss. Instead, a stagnant current of air heavily coagulated with the stench of primordial minerals, of gray limestone, and of the blinding soot exclusively indigenous to subterranean mine shafts plunging hundreds of meters below the earth, flooded directly into his sinus cavities. Yet, the anomaly that halted Vane dead on the staircase, causing him to furrow his brow and hoist the lantern high to illuminate the cavern below, was the humidity. Or, to articulate it with clinical accuracy, its absolute, utter absence. Harlan County was a waterlogged dominion. The subterranean water tables within these hollows slithered maliciously close to the crust, and the bedrock veins perpetually, stubbornly refused to cooperate with any of humanity's drainage engineering. Cellars across Appalachia invariably bore an undeniable commonality. They were drenched, clammy, reeking of the black mildew that encrusted their corners, with water perpetually weeping from their mortar joints. Yet the catacombs of Caulfield House were arid, not merely existing in a passive state devoid of standing water, but possessing an actively predatory dryness. The atmosphere harbored a razor-sharp, desiccating property, mimicking the air locked within an abyssal cavern hermetically sealed for eons, where the meteorology of the surface world no longer held a shred of relevance. It blasted against Vane's visage, immediately astringing the cold sweat upon his brow, leaching the moisture from his ocular cavities, and rendering his throat parched within a few meager respirations. This was an ecosystem fundamentally hostile to the sustenance of human biology. This absolute desiccation was orchestrated by some architectural mechanism transcending Vane's comprehension, engineered for the singular purpose of safeguarding the one material most vulnerable to the ravages of dampness: documents and dossiers. The crypt mirrored the exact sprawling footprint of the ground floor, its oppressive ceiling sloping downward, heavily ribbed with transverse beams of pitch-black ironwood. Vane's footfalls now grated with a skeletal crunch across the freezing slate floor. The amber luminescence from his lamp washed over the eastern wall, unearthing protracted rows of timber shelving. Adorning the racks was a menagerie of artifacts that violently resisted any conventional taxonomy. Glass apothecaries of wildly varying dimensions were hermetically sealed with brutally thick caps of wax, harboring fluids that were opaquely dark and grotesquely turbid. Desiccated bundles of botanical specimens lay withered into twisted husks, yet rather than being bundled with twine or hemp, they had been choked together by loops of corroded wire, a trivial, aberrant detail that provoked an inexplicable, creeping revulsion. And then Vane's gaze collided with 3 cubical mahogany cases, the bespoke artisanal caskets historically utilized for harboring optical surveying instrumentation. They rested with mathematical precision adjacent to monolithic ledgers bound in darkened sheepskin. He gravitated toward them, depositing the lamp upon the stone ledge. The dusting upon the wooden lids was the powdery residue of subterranean minerals, not the fibrous lint shed by human habitation. Vane's massive hand glided over the tarnished brass clasp. He flipped it upward. The resulting clack echoed with the sharpness of a guillotine. Nested within the sun-faded velvet lining lay a ponderous brass surveyor's compasses, a heavy gunter's measurement chain, and scrolls of vellum with meticulously folded borders. Vane identified them instantaneously. They were cadastral surveys, drafted by hand employing the distinctive crosshatching and typographical annotations native to the 1860s. He hoisted the uppermost plat, unfurling its span beneath the sickly light. The brittle vellum protested with a dry, abrasive crackling as it scraped against the savagely dehumidified atmosphere. The drafting articulated the scale, and the boundaries of the tract he had presumed belonged to the Caulfield estate. Yet as Vane's calloused fingertip traced along the ink lines that had long since oxidized into the hue of dried blood, his cardiac rhythm derailed into a violent arrhythmia. He didn't send anyone to help. The demarcation of the property did not align in the slightest with the geography he had conceptualized during his approach. It originated at the manor, cannibalized the entirety of the dense hemlock forest, extended radically eastward to breach a precipitous limestone ridgeline, hooked northward, tracing a subterranean creek, and then aggressively zigzagged to encircle a barren, desolate basin before finally sealing its monstrous circumference. Vane calculated the figures silently within his mind. According to the scale inscribed at the map's lower corner, the spatial expanse encompassed by these ink strokes was no less than 400 acres. 400 acres deep within the core of the Appalachian Mountains. This was no modest estate belonging to some nouveau riche parvenu seeking refuge from society. This was the scale of an autonomous territory. Vane stared fixedly at the name Harmon Caulfield, meticulously penned in the section designating ownership, a name that had never existed within any tax registry he had ever consulted at the Lexington City Hall. Whosoever possessed a tract of land this vast, erecting an architectural monolith that defied its era and preserving it through preternatural techniques, such an entity could not possibly be a mere mortal. This house was not a domicile. Those 400 acres constituted a quarantine perimeter. Caulfield House was a sentinel station, an outpost violently thrust into this untamed wilderness to stand guard, to measure, and to monitor something infinitely more colossal than the fate of a single human being. The sensation of his own utter insignificance before the megalomania of a subterranean system began to crush Vane's professional pride. He folded the parchment, smoothed the creases, and tucked it back into the mahogany case. He hoisted the lantern, turning his back upon the rows of shelving, and waded deeper toward the northern reaches of the cellar. He didn't send anyone to help. The further he ventured, the lower the ceiling descended, forcing him to hunch his broad back to avoid striking his crown against the transverse beams. He didn't send anyone to help. This was the physical coercion of the architecture. It compelled the interloper to assume a posture of sheer submission before ever brushing against the core of its secret. At the absolute terminus of the crypt, the lantern's glow washed over a massive stone wall laid in a honeycomb pattern. It appeared perfectly identical to the rest of the foundation, ashen, abrasive, and steeped in the lingering stains of time. Yet, Vane's eyes were the eyes of a man who specialized in excavating the deceptions woven into physical structures. He closed the distance to the wall, bringing the lantern flush against the boulder's surface. There was zero mortar. The stone blocks had been chiseled and married together with such agonizing precision that not even a razor's edge could slip between them. A masonry technique wholly alien to the crude stonecutters of Kentucky. It was excessively flawless, excessively smooth. Vane curled his hand into a fist, and with the knuckle of his index finger, he rapped forcefully against the stone face. Yud. The reverberation that answered was not the mournful, hollow thud of solid rock extending deep into the earth. It was a thin echo, harboring a distinct vibration. Behind this carapace of stone lay a void, a pocket of air lying in wait. He stood squarely before that invisible barricade, his exhalations steady within the agonizing silence. Recalling the caveat upon the slip of parchment in the bedchamber, Vane understood that violence was not the key to this lock. This house operated upon invisible bureaucratic protocols. It demanded exactitude, not brute force. He laid his massive hand flat against the abrasive surface of the central stone, applying a gentle pressure. Nothing occurred. He exhaled sharply, sliding his palm roughly 4 inches to the left, and once more channeled his body weight into a subtle push. This time, the stone wall answered. There was absolutely no gnashing of unlubricated hinges, no abrasive grinding of stone upon stone. A colossal rectangular slab of the wall gently divorced itself from the structural mass, swinging inward with a macabre, liquid smoothness that sent a violent shudder down his spine. This total absence of friction was an outright blasphemy against the fundamental laws of physics. The gargantuan weight of the stone slab was supported and pivoted by some clandestine mechanical system that was perpetually lubricated, perpetually maintained in a state of supreme perfection, as though it had just been opened yesterday and would undoubtedly be opened again tomorrow. The very instant the door pivoted ajar, a current of air from the subterranean chamber hemorrhaged outward, washing over Vane's shoulders and face. This time, it was not an aroma. It was a manifestation of pure emptiness. It was a frigid atmosphere, yet devoid of the dampness of frost. It breathed upon his flesh a skin-crawling sensation of suspended time. Akin to stepping into a freshly excavated ancient mausoleum, what you inhale is not the atmosphere of the present world, but rather the very air that had been hermetically sealed centuries prior, stagnant, deathly, and heavy with the barometric pressure of the past. The bone-chilling cold that penetrated to his marrow stemmed not from the temperature, but from the horrifying realization that he had just unsealed a Pandora's box bereft of hope, harboring only truths destined to shred his entire worldview into oblivion. Vane swallowed the bitter knot constricting his throat. He elevated the oil lantern, its sickly, jaundiced flame slicing a long corridor through the pitch-black void behind the door, and slowly lifted his boot, crossing the threshold of sheer absurdity. He didn't send anyone to help. Vane's boot heel struck a frictionless floor, and the lantern in his grip swept across the claustrophobic expanse, illuminating a spectacle infinitely more terrifying than the darkness itself. The chamber was scarcely 15 square meters in breadth, devoid of windows, devoid of ventilation shafts, yet the space seemed crushed beneath the sheer weight of what was inextricably plastered across it. Every singular stone surface, from the bone-chilling foundation slab straight up to the oppressively low ceiling, was blanketed in black ink. Initially, the moment his eyes collided with the first wall, Vane's brain intentionally deployed a familiar defense mechanism. It deluded him into believing this was merely the magnum opus of a lunatic, that a paranoid master of the estate, imprisoned in the absolute isolation of the Appalachian ranges, had squandered decades clawing nonsensical scrawls into the masonry during fits of delirium. He didn't respond, but as Vane lethargically hoisted the oil lantern higher, allowing the flickering amber luminescence to flay open every centimeter of the stone surface, that psychological barricade shattered into irredeemable fragments. These were no manic schizophrenic scribbles, overlapping in a chaotic mire of utter despair. This was a methodically orchestrated arrangement. It possessed margins. It harbored subheadings, coherent paragraph delineations, and an informational hierarchy that was ruthlessly legible. It was identical to the ponderous accounting ledgers Vane was so accustomed to consulting at the City Hall, save for the fact that it had been inscribed directly into the anatomical structure of the mountain itself. The identical typography, the identical mechanical razor-sharp pen pressure, devoid of superfluous strokes, utterly lacking any tremor of human emotion or muscular fatigue. He didn't send anyone to help. This calligraphy was an exact twin to the ink upon the letter of commission delivered to his Cincinnati office 10 days prior, and a flawless mirror to the warning note resting obediently beneath the bedchamber's floorboards. Inhuman perfection, reiterated tens of thousands of times across these 4 colossal walls, caused Vane's stomach to clench in an agonizing spasm. He tasted the coppery tang of iron bleeding into his oral cavity as his jaws unconsciously ground together. He advanced another step toward the southern wall, pressing the lantern so dangerously close to the stone that the back of his hand could register the frost radiating from it. The Chronicle of Caulfield House commenced here. In the year 1848, this tract of land was received. Vane mouthed the word silently in his mind, feeling a glacial tremor cascade down his spine. The dossier did not employ the term purchased, nor inherited, nor even seized. The word received carried a frigid bureaucratic detachment, violently stripping away the entire human construct of civil property. The text explicitly delineated the terms of reception via a document cipher, omitted from this wall, from a remitting party bearing an ambiguous moniker, resembling the designation of an institution far more than the name of an individual. Vane read with agonizing slowness, tracking the lantern's beam across line after line. Cold sweat beaded, pooling at his temples and stinging the corners of his eyes, yet he dared not blink. The masonry continued to detail the construction process initiated in 1849, the excavation of the stone foundation, and the establishment of an arid, climate-controlled ecosystem for the cellar in 1853. Every single architectural minutiae Vane's expert eyes had catalogued since morning was now objectively ratified upon this wall. And then, commencing in 1859, following 6 years of Harmon Caulfield residing in solitude, the nature of the dossier began to mutate. Associates began to materialize within the ledger. Vane swallowed hard. His throat was as abrasive as sandpaper. The archive did not refer to them as guests, did not refer to them as family, nor as servants or prisoners. They were singularly categorized as associates. The names emerged, tethered to durations of residency calibrated down to the precise day. And then, the verbiage of the wall grew circumspect, razor-sharp, adopting the clinical evasiveness of an autopsy report. They departed. The horror did not reside in gore-soaked depictions. There was no slaughter laid bare. The zenith of psychological terror lay in the fact that this dossier classified their departures into 2 starkly defined status columns. Certain instances were stamped as resolved, while others were branded unresolved. This residence was not a criminal bastion in any conventional sense. It was a triage station. It was an installation designed for the digestion of human beings, operating under the guise of an apathetic administrative protocol. An analytical engine, calculating resistance, dissecting the behavioral patterns of the specimens drawn into its maw, only to regurgitate an outcome rubber-stamped as resolved. The very concept of the soul, of human free will, was stripped bare and eviscerated upon this wall. Beneath the lens of the entity that had authored this dossier, mankind was reduced to mere biological specimens requiring tabulation. Suddenly, at the exact moment, Vane prepared to transition his reading to the eastern wall, piercing through the oppressively low ceiling, penetrating the colossal ironwood joists and the impeccably sound-proofed floorboards. A sound plummeted downward. Yud. Vane froze in place. The flame within the glass chimney in his grip seemed to physically recoil, adopting a sickly, jaundiced yellow. His lungs ceased to function. He halted mid-step, petrified in a contorted, half-crouched posture. Thud. It was the tread of a footstep upon the ground floor, directly above his head. The vacuum-sealed stillness of the house, that silence which had coagulated and wrung his auditory senses dry since morning, was now violently torn asunder by a merciless, distinct, and highly coherent rhythm. He didn't send anyone to help. Had it been the scuttling of a rat colony, Vane would have felt a surge of salvation. Had it been the stealthy, hurried footfalls of a vagrant thief ransacking the furnishings, he might even have been prepared to unsheathe the small dagger from his pocket and face the intruder. But this cadence obliterated any hope of a mundane human entity. The footsteps hammered against the timber boards with a ponderous, metronomic regularity, possessing a flawless interval of silence between each strike. 1, 2, 3. It carried a colossal gravitational weight, causing the cellar ceiling joists to shudder violently, showering microscopic mineral dust that drifted down upon Vane's shoulders and his peppered, graying hair. It migrated from the vestibule, sluggishly traversing the parlor. The entity was neither fleeing nor hunting. The realization that the thing was in absolutely no hurry was what allowed sheer terror to clamp onto Vane's bronchi like a frostbitten talon. The footsteps bore the signature of a routine patrol. It was akin to a warden strolling the corridors of a maximum security penitentiary, leisurely glancing into each cell because he knew with absolute certainty that no inmate could possibly escape. The house was autonomously auditing its internal metrics, and Vane bitterly realized he was no intruder. He was merely an insect that had unwittingly flown into and become inextricably snared upon a gargantuan web, trembling as it awaited the spider's approach. He didn't send anyone to help. The footsteps ceased directly above the kitchen's coordinates, dead center above the camouflaged cellar door behind the shelving. It was standing at the very precipice of the stone stairwell. The survival instinct shrieked within Vane's skull, demanding he instantly lower the wick, extinguish the flame, hold his breath, and burrow deep into the most Stygian corner of this chamber. Darkness was the solitary armor of the prey. But in this very moment, something else within Vane's constitution, a professional obstinacy, a fanatical devotion to documenting reality to salvage his own sanity, reared up and eclipsed even the fear of death. He was an appraiser. His vocation was the documentation of all things. If he cowered in the dark and perished, this absurd existence would persist as a secret, and his entire paradigm of the world would crumble into utter meaninglessness. With a jerky, rigored motion, Vane slammed the lantern down upon the stone floor. He thrust his hand into his coat pocket, extracting the leather-bound journal Chaotic with dimensional metrics regarding foundation depth and timber quality. Flipping frantically through the heavily scripted pages, he hunted down a pristine white sheet. His massive, calloused hand shook violently as it seized the stubby pencil, scarcely the length of a single knuckle. He had to transcribe this wall. At all costs, this absurdity had to be physicalized, had to be translated from the stone canvas of an inhuman machine onto the fibrous parchment of mankind. The lantern's murky illumination began to sputter mercilessly. The oil reserve within the glass belly had plummeted, scraping the absolute bottom without his noticing. The chamber flickered incessantly between a sickly, jaundiced glare and spectral shadows that danced in a chaotic frenzy to the rhythm of his rapid, arid respiration. The abrasive scratch of graphite skidding across paper erupted, vulgar and maniacal, lacerating the cellar's silence. Vane's penmanship, historically renowned within real estate circles for being as pristine and razor-sharp as etchings upon a zinc plate, now skidded across the page, grotesque and severely slanted. He buried his nose into the journal, darted his eyes up to the wall, and plunged back into his feverish scrawling. He didn't send anyone to help. The ink from the rock face cascaded relentlessly into his consciousness, and he frantically bled it out through the tip of his pencil. The musculature in his right hand began to petrify, contorting into a knot of agonizing spasms under the excruciating pressure. His knuckles flushed a livid red, his joints popped and ground together. Perspiration dripped from his brow, smudging the faint graphite strokes. Vane ground his teeth, a strangled groan rupturing from the depths of his throat. In a fit of sheer obstinacy, he transferred the sweat-drenched pencil stub to his left hand. The clumsiness of his offhand reduced the script to the frantic googings of a hysterical child, yet he did not cease. He continued to transcribe with violent ferocity. Beyond the wall, the footsteps had commenced their descent down the stellar stairs. Scrape, scrape. The abrasive rasp of boot soles grinding against the boulder treads forced the crypt's air to circulate in a dense, pressurized current. The entity was encroaching. It did not charge down. It descended one measured step at a time. Vane ignored it. He bit down until his lower lip ruptured, the metallic, saline tang of blood mingling with the stench of ancient mildew as he glared at the eastern wall and wrote. He wrote as though every syllable were his final dying breath. The footsteps finally struck the slate foundation of the main cellar. They navigated toward the wooden cases housing the optical surveying instruments. He didn't send anyone to help. The very objects he had just handled, the freezing mist within the chamber seemed to congeal, crystallizing the sweat on the nape of Vane's neck into needles that pricked with mind-numbing agony. He didn't send anyone to help. The oil lamp choked out a subtle hiccup. The flame retreated down to the very lip of the wick, hemorrhaging more than half of its illumination. Darkness flooded the room, lapping at the hem of Vane's coat. He possessed mere minutes before being plunged into absolute blindness within this stony stomach. Vane shifted his gaze to the final precipice, the northern wall. This was the terminal expanse harboring the most recent dossiers, the records inching closest to the current timeline. A dying light cruelly forced him to bury his face flush against the freezing rock wall so intimately that the tip of his nose grazed the abrasive surface, inhaling the distinct musty odor of thousands of words entwined with the stagnant scent of minerals. His heart hammered with psychotic fury, battering against his chest cavity, like a sledgehammer intent on shattering his rib cage. His eyes strained upward, pupils dilated to their absolute zenith, sweeping across the terminal lines of the chronicle. And then, every vestige of sound, encompassing him, including the frantic friction of the graphite and the pounding of his own heart, was extinguished. His respiration fractured. Ink upon the stone face in this section did not bear the desiccated, pitch-black hue sunken into the rock grain like the previous walls. Beneath the final, dying embers of the flame, these characters gleamed with a slick, watery film. They were radiantly fresh. They had just been inscribed. At the paramount line of this final passage, stationed as an independent heading, was a date, October 10th, 1902. That was today. Vane's vision blurred as tears hemorrhaged from a place of absolute terror, yet the razor-sharp brain of the appraiser mercilessly compelled him to absorb, to read every single syllable in its entirety. The text was architected with that familiar mechanical perfection. Not a single stroke errant, not a millimeter out of alignment. Mr. Vane has arrived. He has completed his inspection of the static preservation structures of the ground and upper floors. He has located the survey documents. He has discovered this archival chamber. He didn't send anyone to help. He will terminate his transcription of the record in a state of panic at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon. He will depart the premises prior to 4 o'clock. He will never return to Harlan County. This dossier shall be updated with the status of resolved immediately following his departure. The pencil slipped from his numb, paralyzed left fingers, plummeting to the stone floor with a hopeless, pathetic clatter. Vane stood rooted to the earth, his massive shoulders sagging in utter defeat, his eyes bulging as he stared at the verdict of his own existence, visibly carved into the cliff face. This inscription was no blood-soaked threat. It was not a coercion, nor a mandate demanding submission. It was tens of thousands of times more ruthless and magnificent than that. He didn't send anyone to help. It was a physical truth that had been established and documented before Vane had even conceived the notion of executing it. His frantic, exhausting crusade to transcribe the ledger, his desperate rebellion to safeguard the borders of his sanity, and even this exact moment of psychological collapse upon discovering the inscription itself. All of those biological and psychological reactions had been calculated, quantified, and logged into the ledger as a foregone conclusion in the house's history. He was not a man reading a prophecy. It was a string of algorithms executing with 100% accuracy according to a pre-programmed script within this panopticon, this colossal glass observation box. Beyond the invisible partition, the footsteps had halted. He didn't send anyone to help. The entity was standing directly on the other side of the stone facade, less than an arm's length from Vane. There was no breathing, no acoustic friction, only the absolute, dead silence of a system awaiting its specimen to finalize the cycle. The oil lamp emitted a muted, sizzling hiss. The final droplet of kerosene was immolated, and the flames snuffed out. The architecture swallowed Vane into a viscous, pitch-black void. Within that blinding darkness, where nothing remained save for the frigid stench of minerals and the phantom odor of cedar drifting down from the upper levels, the hubris of a man who believed he could appraise every reality on earth was comprehensively buried. His free will had never existed within Caulfield House. He was merely an obedient variable, and now he retained exactly one solitary choice: to docilely adhere to the next step in the dossier so that he might be rubber-stamped as a survivor. Aurelius Vane chose capitulation. Within the quagmire of blinding darkness, as the oil lantern withered into a singular wisp of acrid soot, Vane dropped to his knees upon the slate floor. He did not extend his hands outward in self-defense. Instead, his massive, trembling, and numb fingers groped blindly across the freezing stone, desperately hunting for the leather-bound journal. He didn't send anyone to help. When the familiar texture of the leather grazed his palm, he lunged for it like a drowning wretch seizing a splintered plank, clutching it violently against his spasmodically heaving chest. Outside the invisible barrier, there was no sound whatsoever. The entity did not breach the room to rend him limb from limb. It had no need to. It had promulgated a script, and Vane understood that the remainder of the performance fell entirely upon him. Through a Herculean exertion of will to command his panic-strung musculature, Vane retreated. His boot heels grated, producing a fragile, grinding noise. He backed into the slightly ajar stone door, squeezing his frame through that immaculate fissure, exiting the chamber overflowing with weeping ink-black lines. Instant his shoulders cleared the threshold, the gargantuan slab of stone pivoted backward with a gentle, silky grace. A muted clack echoed as the stone edges bit flawlessly into one another, so immaculate that it would not permit a single breath of air to escape. The archival vault plunged back into its invisible existence, bearing away the ratified sentence of one man's cowardice. Vane staggered across the primary cellar, fumbling through the abyss, guided solely by his memory of the spatial schematics he had charted. The arid atmosphere of the mine was gradually usurped by the familiar oppressive barometric pressure as he clawed his way up the stone stairs. And then the pungent, razor-sharp stench of cedar crashed down once more, draping over him like a burial shroud. The house was enveloping him in its embalming fragrance, not as an act of intimidation, but as an absolute confirmation that he had successfully completed the audit cycle. He didn't send anyone to help. When Vane shoved aside the camouflaged door behind the kitchen pantry and stumbled out onto the ground floor, the surroundings seemed to decompress. The clock upon the mantelpiece still read 11 minutes past 3. The stillness here no longer functioned as a crushing vise upon the eardrums. Instead, it wore an aura of glacial indifference. Vane did not sprint. He recognized that he could not run, for the very act of fleeing carried the implication of rebellion. He didn't send anyone to help. He buried the journal in his breast pocket, fastened the button with stiffened fingers, and smoothed the creases in the lapels of his heavy coat. He was masquerading as a consummate appraiser who had merely concluded his day's labor. He marched in a direct line toward the vestibule, extended his hand to grip the brass lever of the violently saturated red door, and hauled it open. The October atmosphere of the Appalachian mountains struck him squarely in the face, bearing a flesh-flaying chill, the odor of putrefying foliage and natural fungal mold. It was the flavor of rot, of the physical law of entropy, that magnificent reality Vane had desperately yearned to inhale over the agonizing span of the past few hours. He stepped out into the open, slamming the blazing red door shut behind his back. There was no mechanical click of a lock. The manor simply sealed itself off, repatriating him to the realm of organisms that were slowly, inexorably rotting toward death. At the perimeter of the hemlock stand, Prospect remained anchored. Her spine was still bowed, her nostrils flaring, her obsidian eyes blown wide with hypervigilance. Vane lurched forward, undoing the knot of the reins. His hand gently patted the mare's neck, registering the radiating heat and the sweat-drenched hide of a genuinely living creature. As he hoisted his weight into the saddle, Prospect required no command. She pivoted, taking elongated, frantic strides, her hooves pulverizing the brittle carpet of dead leaves, hastily ushering her master beyond the boundaries of those 400 unnatural acres. Vane absolutely refused to cast a glance backward. The subterranean stone wall had decreed that he would depart prior to 4 o'clock, and that he would never return to Harlan County. To turn his head in order to verify whether the armature was mutating, or if some monstrosity was giving chase, would constitute a breach of their silent pact. His pride was annihilated, yet his instinct for survival burned more violently than ever before. He hunched low over the mare's back, surrendering to the fog and the ashen gloom of the autumn twilight as it swallowed his silhouette whole. 11 days following that horrific ordeal, the Cincinnati office of Colecraftoft and Associates dispatched an appraisal report. It was a masterpiece of professional integrity. The numerical data was flawlessly typewritten onto crisp white stationery. The dimensions of the chambers, the caliber of the oak floorboards, the structural integrity of the stone foundation, the estimated valuation of the unblemished furnishings, and the expansive acreage of the estate far exceeding the initial commission. The ledger compiled by Aurelius Vane omitted not a single physical detail, yet there was an absolute void of vocabulary referencing the arid cellar, the impossibly potent stench of cedar, the invisible boulder door, or the walls blanketed by bureaucratic decrees soaked in cold sweat. Vane had executed his mandate within that colossal dossier with lethal precision. He had become a conspirator. The remuneration arrived punctually via a bank draft, routed through a shell organization whose signatory was most certainly not Orvis Pell. Vane accepted the funds, entombed them within an iron safe, and vainly attempted to utilize the banality of everyday mathematics to bury his memories. Yet, in the vernal awakening of 1903, the curiosity of a man who had once worshipped objective truth gnawed at his conscience. He attempted to draft a letter, a feeble, probing maneuver directed at the Harlan County clerk, requisitioning a transcription of the probate files pertaining to the Harmon Caulfield estate. 6 weeks hence, the rejoinder arrived, stamped with a dry crimson seal. No real property, death certificate, nor tax ledger bearing the nomenclature of Harmon Caulfield had ever existed within the archival history of Harlan County. Vane subsequently engaged an acquaintance deeply entrenched in the Lexington legal fraternity to conduct a clandestine inquiry. The dividends returned remained a hollow, absolute zero. It was only then that Vane comprehensively perceived the freezing omnipotence of the entity casting its net around him. This system possessed no need to dispatch assassins in black coats. It had no requirement to incinerate his home or orchestrate a fatal carriage accident. Its terrifying grandeur resided in its capacity for administrative erasure. They did not erase the flesh. They eradicated the data. A 400-acre expanse anchoring a 3-story stone chateau was quite simply expunged from the ledgers of humanity. It existed corporeally, yet within the realms of jurisprudence and societal consciousness, it was a phantom. An overwhelming paralysis of utter impotence drove Vane to lock his leather-bound journal into the deepest cavern of his desk drawer, forsaking all intentions of ever proving the truth. Aurelius Vane perished in 1931 due to a myocardial infarction, expiring right at the writing desk within his private residence, thereby concluding a placid, prosperous, and secure existence at the age of 67. He had survived, but the ransom for that survival was the burden of harboring a festering, purulent laceration within his psyche for 29 long years. A scant few months prior to his demise, propelled by senescence and a fixation he could not exorcise, he contracted a highly skilled transcriptionist from the firm of Alderman and Bright to type out the final passages of his journal. But that woman, having collided with those slanted, panic-stricken verses detailing a stone wall that calibrated the future, snapped the journal shut after a mere 2 pages. She returned it, accompanied by a brutally terse note. "I do not believe I am the right person for this work." The primal instinct of the human animal remains eternally sensitized to anything that threatens to rupture its paradigm. The diary subsequently drifted into the custody of a distant cousin, unceremoniously stuffed into a cedar-lined trunk, a sickeningly ironic coincidence, or yet another immaculate intervention orchestrated by the system, and lay there in mute isolation until the year 1958. Upon the cousin's passing, the trunk was bequeathed to the Northern Kentucky Historical Society. He didn't send anyone to help. It was within those walls that the journal encountered Delphine Crowe, a 34-year-old archivist renowned for her surgical meticulousness and a total dearth of whimsical imagination. Late one afternoon, Delphine serendipitously extracted the diary from a decaying stack of 19th-century property deeds. She fluttered through a few of the central pages, her eyes gliding over the barren metrics before grinding to a halt upon the frantic, manic scrawls of the final passages. Delphine stood rooted there, deep within the archival catacombs, suffocating under the stench of rotting paper, and consumed 2 full pages in their entirety. The atmosphere enveloping her seemed to coagulate. The ambient temperature plummeted by several degrees. She was seized by a wave of mild nausea, a violently ferocious rebellion of her own neurology as it struggled to digest a non-physical reality. Possessing a mortuary composure, Delphine snapped the diary closed. She did not draft a report to her superiors. She did not summon a colleague to bear witness. She deposited the book into an anonymous cardboard box, employing a black marker to carve a crude inscription across the lid, "Miscellaneous, low priority." That very evening, Delphine fractured her routine, ducking into a dimly lit tavern to order a glass of gin, neat, a libation she would never dream of imbibing on a Tuesday. Yet the true, unfathomable horror did not descend until the following dawn. When she breached the archival chamber, the cardboard box branded "Miscellaneous" no longer resided in its original locus. There were 0 signs of forced entry. Absolutely no one else had accessed the room. However, the box had migrated precisely 3 feet to the left, methodically displacing other dossiers to slot itself flawlessly into the most lightless, forgotten crevice of the shelving unit. The system was not merely observing within Harlan County. Its tendrils penetrated everywhere. The migration of the box was no cheap, spectral poltergeist phenomenon. It was the physical recalibration executed by a subterranean management apparatus, engineered to deposit the journal into the exact coordinate of absolutely, never to be unearthed again. Delphine Crow stood paralyzed before the stacks, cold sweat hemorrhaging to drench her palms. That very afternoon she submitted a formal petition to be reassigned to the Veteran Photography Classification Project, and she never so much as set foot within the 19th century archival sector ever again. The Journal of Aurelius Vane, harboring the dark sacraments of Caulfield House, sank eternally into the abyss of administrative amnesia. A colossal glass cage slammed shut, entombing the truth beneath 10,000 layers of temporal dust. Aurelius Vane did not perish in that cellar. He did not descend into madness, nor was he hurled into an asylum to shriek about invisible stone walls. He returned, dragging out his days for another 29 years within a comfortable red brick residence in Cincinnati, amassing a considerable fortune, sipping fine teas, and finally drawing his last breath due to a myocardial infarction upon a plush wingback chair. The ultimate happy ending a mortal could ever conjure in their dreams, is it not? Yet, I find myself endlessly obsessing over the precise moment he stood before that monolith, clutching a blunted pencil, his hands seeping blood, and his oil lantern bled dry. He didn't send anyone to help, but dictated that he would depart prior to 4 o'clock. He could have effortlessly chosen to remain. By simply collapsing onto that freezing stone floor, waiting for the pocket watch in his vest to chime 4:01, he would have emerged victorious. He would have shattered the algorithm, proving that the free will of mankind was infinitely superior to the God-forsaken system scripting his destiny. He could have exposed the fallibility of an inhuman machine. He walked away, hasty, obedient, terrified. That was no mere cowardice. It was the most abyssal and tragic survival instinct ingrained within our species. The authentic tragedy of this narrative does not lie in humanity being manipulated by some invisible entity. The tragedy is rooted in the horrific grandeur of the architecture of complicity. He didn't stand the crossroads between a monumental truth that will annihilate the entirety of a safe reality and a fabrication that permits you to continue drawing breath. Universally elect to compromise. We feign absolute blindness, absolute deafness. Because playing the role of an obedient ant crawling along a preordained trajectory within this gargantuan glass terrarium is eternally easier than craning your neck upward to lock eyes with the overseer wielding the magnifying glass. So allow me to ask you this. Do not lie. Do not drape yourself in the cinematic cape of celluloid heroes. He didn't send anyone to help. If you were entombed within that freezing chamber, inhaling the stagnant odor of ancient minerals, and you deciphered a wall describing with surgical precision that you would flee within the next 5 minutes, he didn't send anyone to help. Would you summon every ounce of your strength to sit back down, defying that prophecy regardless of the fact that the abomination standing beyond the door might instantaneously obliterate your very existence? Here, would you meekly adhere to the script, sprinting for your life out the door, squeezing your eyes shut, and praying to God that it spares you to return to a mundane, deceitful life? Leave your verdict in the comments below. I am genuinely morbidly curious to see how many among us are prepared to fracture the narrative, and how many are willingly nailing shut the cedar-lined coffin of their own lives. This is Appalachian Mountain Stories. If you possess the fortitude to pry beneath the loose floorboards that history has so painstakingly sought to bury, strike that subscribe button. Keep your eyes open.